I'm surprised, the population in the United States is 350 million people. There are 40 million Christians that don't vote. There are 15 million Christians that aren't even registered to vote. And I don't know if you've been paying attention, but sometimes elections can be lost or won by 100,000 votes. When we look at those kinds of numbers, I am amazed at what kind of country we could have if 55 million Christians got out and voted righteously. It can be tough because sometimes you have candidates that none of the candidates look righteous. But we're going to look at some texts today that I hope will give us some insight. And obviously, we're going to want God to tell us how we should be during these times. So that's why we're doing the sermon series, God and Government. Today, I think I'm just going to touch on voting. And let me touch on just a couple things here as we get into the sermon. Christians are going to be a transcendent kind of people. Believers and all of us here are going to have, when people hear our 2 cents worth, right? Because you're allowed to give your 2 cents worth. When you're done, people may want their change back, but you're sitting down to have coffee, and your 2 cents is important and is powerful. And I want to drive that home because sometimes when we get met with awkward situations, discomfort, and we start to think, man, if I wouldn't have said anything at all, I could have sat through this whole lunch and had a good time. But the fact that I said something righteous, the fact that I said something biblical, has sure made this lunch or this coffee date awkward. I want to appeal to you and talk just a little bit about the nature of a believer. Most of the world is going to live in a material reality. They're going to base their ideologies, their choices, their decisions, their outlook on life, their worldview. A lot of people are going to base their worldview on what they hear on the news, right? A lot of people are going to be uninformed, and they're going to base their decisions and choices on what they read in the paper, what they hear from their favorite blog guy, what they hear from their favorite YouTube guy, and that's going to become their worldview. Usually those worldviews are something that is expedient, quick and easy, looks appealing in the short term, but we know that God gives us a transcendent worldview because God knows the big picture in the long term. And therefore, we're going to have different opinions than some people. Jesus said that He came so that the world might know the truth. And what's important to us about that is if Jesus said, I came into the world so that the world could know the truth, then that means without Jesus' words, without biblical words, people will be misled and they will believe the lie. That's how we understand that phrase. I came to straighten things out and show you the truth. Without Jesus, we're concerned that people are going to believe a lie. And there are lots of lies going around in our world today. So we have a transcendent reality. I always use the words transcendent. I think it just sounds cool. But we can talk about this material reality, which is all the YouTube channels, all the news channels, the things that are happening around the coffee chamber at your work. That's the material reality. Only Jesus and God can give us a transcendent reality. But the Bible calls it something different. The Bible calls it the difference between the flesh and the spirit. Let me just show you that text. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 16. He says, so I say, walk by the Spirit, and you will not gratify the desires of the flesh, because the flesh craves what is contrary to the Spirit, and the Spirit what is contrary to the flesh. These are opposed to each other, so that you don't do what you want. Boy, that's a powerful piece of text. We're going to be the kind of people that walk around doing what the Spirit would have us do. And if we are that kind of people that are subjecting and submitting our lives to what the Spirit wants us to do, then the world is going to find we don't do the things we want to do. There's a conflict there. And if we start talking about the spiritual things that God would have, and we're out in our community that is basing their life on the fleshly things, we should all be prepared that they're not going to like your insight sometimes, because the Spirit is opposed to what the flesh likes. And the flesh doesn't like the things that the Spirit likes. So there is going to be a very strange dynamic for us as believers when we find ourselves in our community. Let me take you back. Jesus made this clear to his disciples to say, look, when you start embracing Spirit-filled words, that's going to cause problems in your life. Let me take you to Luke chapter 12 and verse 51. Jesus taught his disciples, do you think that I have come to give peace on earth? No, I tell you, rather division. From now on, in one house there will be 5 divided, 3 against 2, or 2 against 3. And they will be divided, a father against his son, and a son against his father, and a mother against her daughter, and a daughter against her mother, mother-in-laws against their daughter-in-laws, daughter-in-laws against mother-in-laws. And that's a sad, tragic reality. Jesus prayed, God, I wish they could all be one. I wish they could all be one and have harmony. But he says, but the problem is, when people begin to live by the Spirit of God, they are going to engage in a life that is contrary to the flesh. And if there are family members, if there are siblings, if there are people at work that are still in the flesh, then your worldview is going to be completely at odds with their worldview. So we prepare for that. We understand that. And then we need to understand, as we go into our sermon topic here, that God endorses human governments. Let me take you to that, Romans chapter 13. The whole of Romans 13 talks about God endorsing human governments, but they are supposed to be His servants to do good to righteous people and to rain down the wrath of God on wicked people. That is the purpose of your government. Let's read it, verse 51. Oops. Verse 3. For the rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you'll receive his approval. Because he is God's servant for your good. I'd put a square around God's servant. But if you do wrong, then be afraid, because he does not bear the sword in vain. He is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on wrongdoers. That is the God-ordained purpose of government. To exalt and protect righteous people and to rain down the wrath of God on lawless people. Sometimes we may look at government and it looks like it's the exact opposite of that. And what we recognize is these are servants of God that are supposed to be doing what their master wants them to do, but we know that sometimes servants are rebellious and they're doing what they want and not what the master wants. So how do we deal with that? How do we cope with that? Jesus had to subject himself to a local government. He was presented before Pontius Pilate. Pontius Pilate was going to decide the fate and the future of Jesus. Pontius Pilate is supposed to be God's servant. He was supposed to be ordained to protect the righteous and to punish the wicked. But we know that he's going to fail at his job as he prosecutes Jesus. And what does Jesus say at that moment? Pilate, you wouldn't have any power at all if it had not been given to you from above. God, my God, is the one that gave you your job, Pilate. That's an interesting bit of information to reflect on. So how are we doing in this political season? Are we informed? Are we uninformed? Do we care? Do we not care? Do we think we should be participating? Do we think that we can't make a difference and we should just let God work everything out? So today's sermon topic, we're going to go to the book of Jeremiah, specifically Jeremiah chapter 29, and we're going to glean some information that God gave to Jeremiah. So as our sermon topic, you might watch for what are God's 4 instructions to Jeremiah. A little bit of the background of Jeremiah that I think is going to be interesting before we start our text. Jeremiah was in Jerusalem, and you would think Jerusalem would be the utopia, because in Jerusalem you've got walls, so you're protected. In Jerusalem you've got the God-ordained priesthood, so you should be exalting righteousness. In Jerusalem you have the temple, and in the temple is the Holy of Holies, which is where, at that time, where the presence of God was. You would think the closer you could get to that temple, the better. So that was the ideal place to be, but Israel didn't like God's authority. When we study first century Greco-Roman Jerusalem, we find out that they were more Greco-Roman than they were Jewish. That's what history tells us. The priesthood wasn't righteous anymore. It was all about power and authority. And so God ultimately gives Jerusalem, if you remember the story, God sends Assyria to destroy the northern 10 tribes of Israel. And then he begins sending prophets down to the lower 2 tribes of Judah in Jerusalem. And what he tells Jerusalem is, hey guys, I want you to look north. And I want you to see what I did to 10 of the tribes that chose to be rebellious and not regard my rules. I've completely destroyed them and sent them into exile. That is a cue for you to learn from them, repent and change your ways, and live a godly, righteous life. Otherwise, I will come and do the same thing to you that I did to the northern 10 tribes. God waits 150 years. The northern 10 tribes were destroyed roughly in 720 BC. God gives Jerusalem 150 years, so sometime in the 500s, Jerusalem rebels. They decide they don't like God's rules. They don't like the things that He wants them to do. And so ultimately what happens to a nation that rejects God and His desire for them, ultimately God says, okay then, you don't like being under my rule. I'll send another nation in to dominate you. And I'll sit back and give you 100 or 200 years to see how you like being governed by another God. How do you like being governed by false gods? How do you like being ruled by your enemies? And then maybe we can revisit whether or not you like me as your God, or do you prefer to have your enemies as your God? So that's what happens. Israel is on their way out. Babylon, by the time we get to Jeremiah chapter 29, Jeremiah is in jail and Babylon has already come in and been destroying Jerusalem, and it's obvious we're going to be massacred, we're going to be sent off to exile. So God tells them what to do while they're in exile. Let's start out in verse 1. Now these are the words of the letter that Jeremiah the prophet sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders of the exile, and to the priests, to the prophets, and all the people whom Nebuchadnezzar had taken into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile. Ooh, I'd probably put a square around that, guys. This was no accident. This was not because you voted for the wrong party. This was because I have gotten upset with you guys. I have sent Jerusalem to Babylon. So here's what you should do, verse 5. Build houses, live in them, plant gardens, eat the produce. Verse 6, take wives for yourself and have sons and daughters. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they can bear sons and daughters and multiply there. Do not decrease. Fascinating. What do you do while you're living in enemy territory? Build houses, become part of the community, figure out how you're going to support your family, how you're going to raise your family, how you're going to provide housing for your family. Marry off and have lots of kids. Don't quit having kids, he says. Continue to multiply. Be responsible. Put a roof over your family's head. It's interesting that some would think, well, ideally, if you're not in the place you want to be, you withdraw from society. You go over here and you hide out in your own little place and you make your own little niche and you kind of isolate yourself. But that's not what he says. He says, join society. Jesus in his prayer in John chapter 17, Jesus in his prayer makes something clear about believers. Verse 15, he says, Father, I'm not asking you to take them out of the world. I'm just asking you to protect them from all of the evil that is about to surround them. But don't take them out. Something powerful about that. He didn't say escape into caves and go into hiding and isolate yourself. There's also another text where Jesus tells his disciples, hey, here's the deal. I'm sending you out into the world as sheep amongst wolves. I'm not isolating you from that. I'm sending you into the world to be amongst the wolves. Why would he do that? Because he wishes some of those wolves would become sheep. He wishes those wolves would make God, their master, and they can only do that if the sheep are in the midst of the wolves, testifying to the wolves. That's why God is willing to do that. You're the salt of the earth. I need you to get out there and permeate your communities. And when the Bible talks about being the salt of the earth, he's talking about salt as a preservative. In the old days, they used to put salt over meat in order to preserve the meat, to keep it from getting too rotten or too stale. So your presence in the community is the only thing that's going to stop your community from becoming too rotten. We need holy, righteous people shining their lights in the community. When we study Thessalonians, something happens in Thessalonians, and the believers in Thessalonica think, well, there's no sense blending in with this community because Jesus is going to come back any day now. So we're not going to try to influence the world we live in. We're just waiting for Jesus to come back, because when Jesus comes back, He'll fix everything. And there are some people that unfortunately kind of think that that's the way the world is today. The world is horrible. We're just waiting for Jesus to come back to take us out of here and take us to heaven. But Jesus already said, no, I don't want to take you out of the world. I want you to stay in the world, and I want you to influence the world that you live in. So in Thessalonica, people were quitting their jobs, laying around doing nothing, and Paul has to come along, and Paul says, hey, that's not what we do. That's not what we do. And in fact, any of you that are just sitting around waiting for Jesus to come back, you guys don't get to eat from now on. Because if any man is not out there working, he should not be eating. That's a fascinating concept. Stay out there, stay in the community, earn your way, pay for your survival, your food, your housing. And if you don't want to do that and you just want to fold your hands and sit on the sidelines and wait for Jesus, he says, you don't get to eat then. Interesting, guys. So that's the first one. Settle down, multiply, have families, engage in your community. Let's move on to verse 7 in Jeremiah 29. Number 2, seek the welfare of the city that you live in. Verse 7, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf. For in its welfare, you will find your welfare. He's calling them to pay attention. Desire the best for whatever community you find yourself in. Desire the best for that community, because that will be what you inherit. Desire the best mayors. Desire the best governors, the best judges, the best DAs. You should have an influence in wanting the right people in those positions. Because if you get the right people in those positions, you ultimately are going to be the one that gets blessed. Pray for them, and it'll be a blessing to you. It would behoove you to get involved and to try to get the right people in the right positions. We need more believers in the school board meetings. We need more believers on the school board, on the city councils, and voting the right people into office. You know, during the COVID crisis, and I forget all the statistics, but I know locally we had an issue that made me start going to some of these school board meetings, is they said most of the COVID decisions were being made by 25 teachers and 2 parents. Does that sound like that's going to be the best choice for your children? 25 teachers, a school board, and 2 parents. And that's how decisions got made. Simply because we weren't showing up, guys. And I believe if we take God's words to Jeremiah, Seek the welfare of your city, because that's where you're going to find yourself living. Be active, be involved. And if we look at history, how things progress, I can remember in my lifetime that the main complaints we had about the educational system was that we don't have very good math scores and we don't have very good reading comprehension. That was our biggest concern back in the day. The concerns are not the same today anymore. Today, the biggest concerns are drag queens in library hour. Today, the biggest concerns are effeminate men that are indoctrinating young children, K through 12, maybe even earlier than that, being sexualized and exposed to sexual acts at such a young age. Is our community getting better or getting worse? And God tells Jeremiah, you better get involved. Because if your city does well, then you're going to have a righteous place to live, and that would be much better for you. Much better for you. Some people think, and maybe even I was a part of that group for a little while, but politics determine how much freedom the church has. There's no doubt about that. But Jesus even said in the Lord's Prayer, let me just take you to it. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 10. Listen to this small part of the Lord's Prayer. Heavenly Father, your kingdom come, your will be done. When? When we finally get out of here and go to heaven? Pray that God's will can be done on the earth right now as it is in heaven. Jesus says we want God's will being done on the earth right now. We're not waiting for some day when Christ comes to fix everything, waiting for some day when we get to leave this place of corruption and go somewhere nicer. He says, no. Pray that the place where you are right now would be like the way things are in heaven. The only way for that to happen is for us to get engaged in our community and in politics. Finally, he says, pray for your community. 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul corroborated this idea. First of all, then I urge you that petitions and prayers and intercessions and thanksgiving be offered for everyone, for all the kings and all those people that are in authority. Here's the reason why, guys, so that we can have tranquil and quiet lives with godliness and dignity. This would be a good thing in God's eyes. We're talking about making sure that we participate in the voting process, but equally as important, he says, make sure you're praying for all of these positions. Praying that they will usher in godliness and dignity so Christians can have a good, happy, quiet life. Because in the welfare of your community is where you are going to find your own welfare. It's in your own best interest, he says. Number 3, don't let yourself be deceived by promises of utopia. It's a little bit different what he says to Jeremiah here. Let's look at it. Verse 8. This is what the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, says. Do not be deceived by the prophets and the diviners amongst you. And do not listen to the dreams that you elicit from them, because they are falsely prophesying to you in my name. I have not sent them, declares the Lord. Let's exposit what God was telling Jeremiah, and let's make a modern day application. God is telling Jeremiah, quit listening to the influential people around you, Jeremiah, because you can see that my wrath is on Jerusalem by the way Jerusalem is disintegrating. So don't believe the people that are telling you visions of utopia. There are prophets that are saying everything's just fine, no problem, let's just keep everything status quo. God says, don't believe those guys. I'm commanding you to repent and to change, or things are going to get worse. I think it's fascinating to try to apply that today. Who are the people that are promising utopia? And God says, don't believe those people. You better be righteous and holy and do what I'm telling you to do. Follow my transcendent wisdom. Be careful not to believe to the local prophets, promise makers, utopia painters, because they're falsely prophesying to you. We live in a world where candidates are painting horrible pictures of the other candidate, and they're promising this individual is going to bring havoc, but we're going to usher in utopia. Christians have to be very careful about that. Let me share with you, are you guys aware that in the 1930s, Germany underwent some horrible, horrible times? Do you know that they willingly elected the person into office that brought them those horrible times? They willingly elected him. How did he get that done? Well, first of all, he spent so much money on the war. Now, I'm sorry, guys. Is it World War I or World War II? That was World War II. Thank you. He spent so much money on his war that he bankrupted his country. When he bankrupted his country, he started printing money to continue financing his war. Before you know it, inflation went nuts, and people couldn't take their entire life's savings out of the bank to buy a loaf of bread at the grocery store. Is it interesting to reflect on the 1930s and take note? The individual spent so much money on war that it created inflation back home. When it created inflation back home, it got to the point where people couldn't afford to buy groceries. Strange. I'm talking about 1930. Some of you think I'm talking about today. But it's the same old playbook. So what happens next? Well, the guy that created the crisis stands up and charismatically says, guys, vote me into office because I can fix it. I promise I can fix it, and I can usher in a utopia for you. And the people believed him. The people believed the guy that created the problem would actually solve the problem, and they voted him into office. That's what happened in the 1930s, Germany under Hitler. So God tells Jeremiah, make sure your eyes are wide open and make sure you're paying attention, because a lot of people are promising utopia, but they are lying to you. I want to take you to a little insight into matters of government. Matthew chapter 23, verse 23. Jesus is going to rebuke the local government in Jerusalem. Local government in Jerusalem was the aristocracy, scribes, Pharisees, Sanhedrin. They were also the spiritual leaders. Notice what he says about them. This is how you can detect a fraud. Matthew 23, verse 23. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You pay your tithe of mint, dill, and cumin, but you have disregarded the weightier matters of the law. Verse 24, you blind guides. You strain out a gnat, but you're swallowing a camel. We need to sit. You guys know what chewing the cud is? See the cows under a tree out there somewhere, and they're just sitting down, but their jaw is moving. We need to chew the cud on that verse right there. Jesus just exposed the aristocracy of his day, saying, you guys are straining out gnats, but you're swallowing camels. And what they were literally doing was making sure that they gave the little percentage of their herb garden that they were supposed to be giving. They were making sure that they gave the little percentage of their cilantro and oregano and cumin. That's what they focused on. What they weren't doing was paying for their parents in their old age, leaving senior citizen, frail parents to flounder on their own when the children should have been paying and taking care of their parents. And they're not doing that, but they are making sure that I bring that cumin and oregano that I'm supposed to bring. And Jesus says, you guys are corrupt. You're hypocritical. You're painting a picture of yourself that's not real because you're focusing on the teeny tiny little things that are insignificant, but you're ignoring the big things that really matter. Okay, let me bring that home, guys. What does that look like today for us? How might a politician be focusing on the insignificant things, but ignoring the really big things? And God says, watch out for guys that are doing that. They're hypocrites. They're false leaders. Let me give you a few examples. This is going to sound so strange. I'm sure it could probably never actually happen, but let me just suggest it to you. What about somebody adamantly opposing plastic straws? We absolutely got to quit using plastic straws. But then they turn around and bail out violent protesters that have set entire cities on fire. I know you probably can't imagine a time when that could ever happen. Focusing on plastic straws as the big utopia for the world, but they're turning loose and they're even paying to get violent protesters out of jail. If you ever see that, you should take note of that because Jesus says something is wrong with that person. They're a hypocrite, they're false, they're not the genuine article. What about, as unlikely as this might sound to you, what about someone that is adamantly protecting the owls in the forest? Got to protect those owls. But they are adamantly fighting for the right to kill babies. Do you guys see? Something is not right about that picture. You want to save little fish that are trying to swim upstream, but you're all for killing babies. Those are the people that are straining out gnats and swallowing whole camels. And Jesus says that's the way you recognize a false leader, a wicked leader, a hypocrite, someone who's going to promise you utopia, but they're lying. The big issues life in the womb, the sanctity of marriage. Should boys be showering in girls' locker rooms? Drag queens twerking? Drag queens twerking in the library. Men grooming grade school children with sexual books that promote sexual acts amongst young people. Children that are being child trafficked because of an open border. The last statistic I heard is that 300,000 children have been separated from their parents and being trafficked in our community. People that are adamant about banning plastic straws, but they're not lifting a finger to help these 300,000 children that have been introduced into child trafficking. Something's wrong there. Wanting to pay for sex change operations for illegal aliens and prisoners. You may think that this is strange, but I've had to counsel with families in our own backyard. Twice, one of them has said, Tony, the school is recommending to my grandchild that they transition because she feels like a boy and the school is encouraging her to transition. These are the major camels that we should be concerned about. And if people are talking to you about fish and straws and stuff like that, those are the wrong people. Lastly, in our text, everything we've looked at so far, the first three are incumbent upon us to do our part. The last one, number 4, reminds us ultimately God is sovereign. God is the one who is overlooking everything. Let me give you that. We come back to our text. Jeremiah 29 and verse 10. This is what the Lord says. When Babylon's 70 years are complete, I will attend to you and I will confirm my promise to restore you back to this place. This place where Jeremiah was Jerusalem. I want you to see the sovereignty of God in this moment. It's going to get really bad. Your enemies are going to come, they're going to take you, they're going to destroy the city, they're going to destroy the temple. They're going to take you to their country, and you're going to be surrounded by false gods and paganism and hedonism, the likes of which you've never imagined. It's going to get really, really bad. But here is God's sovereignty. I'm only going to let it happen for 70 years. Did you catch that? I'm only going to let it happen for 70 years. At the end of 70 years, I'm going to rescue you and I'm going to bring you back to this place. This place was Jerusalem, Utopia. So in that, we see as much as we are called to play a part in our community, we also have to be convinced that God has already got history written down and already knows how things are going to pan out. Let me take you to a couple more texts that show us God's sovereignty here. When God was talking to Abraham, God let Abraham know, Genesis chapter 15, Abraham, I'm going to bless you. I'm going to make your descendants more numerous than the sand of the sea. But for the first 400 years, it's going to be really, really bad for your descendants. It's already been decided. Let's look at it. Genesis 15 and verse 13. Then the Lord said to Abraham, know for certain your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not their own. They will be enslaved and they will be mistreated for 400 years. But I will judge the nation that they serve as slaves, And afterward they will depart there with many possessions. When you guys leave Egypt, I'm going to make you filthy rich. That's what happened. God knew it. God saw it. God talked about it ahead of time. God is sovereign. God has already got it written down. Let me give you one other text. This is back in Jeremiah chapter 18. And God was saying, hey, bad times are in store for Israel. I've already planned it. It's already been written down. It's coming, and there's nothing you can do about it. Sorry, I'm getting caught up in the rhetoric. It's coming, but there is something you can do about it. Let me read that to you. He tells Jeremiah to go to the potter's house, and he says, you see how the potter is making something? He's originally making like a little vase there. But when the vase gets messed up and it doesn't work out, notice how he takes the same piece of clay and does something different with the same piece of clay? Well, that's like me and Israel. I've got an idea for what I'm going to do with Israel. It's destruction. But that can change. Let me read it to you. Jeremiah 18 and verse 7. If at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will pluck it up and break it down and destroy it, if that nation concerning which I have spoken will turn from its evil, then I will relent of the disaster that I intended to do to it. Verse 9, and if at any time I declare concerning a nation or a kingdom that I will build it and plant it, if it does evil in my sight and does not listen to my voice, then I will relent of the good that I had intended to do to it. Every time I read this, I can't help but think of America. We know that God has intended good for a righteous country, a country that started out righteous, that used godly principles, that used the law of Moses in order to found a country and to write a constitution, a declaration that would enable the country to be one of the most righteous countries in the world. And God had planned goodness for America. As we look around at our country lately, we may wonder if that's still true. He says, because if I have planned nothing but goodness for a country, if that country chooses to not listen to me anymore, if they choose to exalt all of the things that I have called an abomination, if they become so warped that they praise horrible things, they start calling good evil and they start calling evil good. If they get to that point, God says, well, I'll change the plans that I originally had for your country. And so there is a sovereignty of God in how countries end up, but through what He told Jeremiah, we find out, hey, it's up to you to try to infect your community and bring the best possible outcome out of your community. It's going to be up to you, because I can always change my mind with what I was originally planning to do with you. Guys, that's the sermon. That's the wisdom we get from analyzing Jeremiah. You know, God couldn't always give us an exact one-to-one answer for everything that we should do in every situation. But when we read the Scriptures, we find a transcendent wisdom that should help create in us a very special thing called discernment. Have we heard of that word? Discernment. Discernment. The blessing that we reap by listening to good sermons, by going to good Bible classes, and by being Bible-centered and Bible-focused is we get transcendent insights that give us discernment on how to do things. I thought this was interesting, guys. Let me show you 2 quick pictures why it's important to participate and get involved. Politics, voting, because politics matter. This is a picture, a satellite picture of North Korea and South Korea. I want you to notice it. I hope you can see it. South Korea is that bottom part there that looks like Africa. That's got all the lights on. You guys find that okay? All the lights in that bottom little piece of land there, all those bright lights, that's South Korea. Go up from there and it looks like the ocean. It looks like water, but it's not. That is a landmass in the north called North Korea. Can you guys spot that landmass? You notice there's no lights in North Korea? What's the difference between North Korea and South Korea? South Korea has freedom. South Korea has an exploding Christian population. South Korea has a democratic process and they have voting. Because of the politics in South Korea, they have freedom and they are flourishing as a result of that. But look at North Korea. The difference in North Korea, there is no freedom whatsoever. There is a dictator. There is Christianity being eradicated in that area, and they have devices where they have made it impossible for people to escape from North Korea. Why on earth would anybody want to escape from North Korea? Do you know what's the difference between the South and the North? Politics. Who is in office? Right now, we still have the beauty of the lights and freedom in our country. But if we let go of politics, if we're not involved in politics, if we just let things run amok, there is nothing stopping the powers that be from turning us into North Korea. Politics matter. That is the quickest way that I would recognize that politics matter. Recently heard a story, an Amish group. An Amish group, they've tried to operate autonomously. They've tried to go out and have their own little communities, and they don't participate in politics or their community. Until lately. The Amish, I don't remember what state this was in, guys, but an Amish community, flourishing, thriving, had government officials come into their area and they made regulations that don't allow them to do certain things like distribute their own milk. They've made regulations. You guys know that milk today, I wish I would have learned the terms now, but it's got to be boiled, it's got to be pasteurized, it's got to be this, it's got to be that in order for it to be safe for consumption. And I'm assuming that the Amish just squirt it into a wood bucket and distribute it right out of the wood bucket. And that's how they thrive and flourish. Maybe they sell eggs. But the government has gone in and made restrictions with those types of things that they were operating just fine. And because of the government regulations imposed on that Amish community, they cannot survive independently anymore. The Amish thought that they didn't need to get involved in politics. But guess what? That community is voting now. That community is getting involved in city councils. They're getting involved in politics because, unfortunately, they found out the hard way that politics will dictate your freedom.